Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents White Lawyer, Black Power, a memoir of civil rights activism in the Deep South, by Donald A. Jelinek, narrated by Keith Sellon-Wright. Foreword. The Black freedom struggle of the 1950s and 1960s was a seminal moment in the American experience. Then, local people, sharecroppers, maids, small business owners, and a handful of black professionals joined with young volunteers from the outside to create a movement that literally changed the course of history. Several of these volunteer activists have written about their experiences in the Deep South. Add to this list the most recent memoir by a white civil rights lawyer named Donald Jelinek, who had worked in Mississippi and Alabama in the mid-1960s. I had never heard of Jelinek, and as author of a book on the civil rights movement in Mississippi, I was skeptical, to say the least. Once I started reading the manuscript, however, I put aside all my reservations. This is, quite simply, a compelling book. Jelinek was an acute observer of race relations during a critical time when the black freedom struggle was undergoing profound changes. The role he played as attorney and activist is unique in the history of the movement. Don Jelinek was born in the Bronx in 1934. After graduating from New York University Law School, he took a job in a Wall Street law firm. In the summer of 1965, he decided to spend 3 weeks in Mississippi working in the Jackson office of the American Civil Liberties Union, headed by the veteran attorney Al Braunstein. Jelinek was not the typical summer volunteer. To begin with, he was headstrong, as he readily admits, and when he was assigned to litigate a case in the small, tough North Mississippi town of Okolona, he took chances and, while securing a verdict in favor of his client, he angered both local whites and Al Braunstein. But Jelinek had experienced the Mississippi high, the intoxication felt by white middle-class civil rights workers who suddenly found themselves thrust into the idealism of the civil rights cause. And at the end of his 3 weeks working for the ACLU, he returned to Okolona, mentored by movement veteran Aviva Futorian, as both an independent attorney and as a civil rights worker. It doesn't take long to realize that Jelinek is a marvelous storyteller. He writes beautifully and with humor. He spent his college and law school summers as a waiter and a stand-up comic on the Borscht Circuit in upstate New York. He integrates relevant historical material seamlessly and uses his own experiences as a volunteer in the movement to illustrate larger themes. His 3-week stint as an ACLU attorney in northern Mississippi required him to spend much of his time in a Holly Springs courtroom dealing with the same judge, lawyers, and courtroom personnel, establishing personal relationships with them that helped him in the court. But, unlike other civil rights lawyers, I could not cross-examine too vigorously, embarrass or humiliate witnesses, or engage in dramatic outside civil rights matters. Still, Jelinek was a white lawyer in hostile territory. He recounts in dramatic detail a harrowing car chase on a deserted rural road where 2 men in a pickup armed with rifles shot up his car and wounded him before he managed to lose them. What is clear throughout the book is that Jelinek felt at home with local people, especially the sharecroppers who took him in and fed and housed him. While gathering signatures for a petition demonstrating that local blacks were denied the right to vote, he spent a day in the fields picking cotton and hours at night just talking to people. It took him nearly 2 weeks to get 20 signatures. At the end of his volunteer assignment, Jelinek returned to New York, only to come back to Mississippi when Braunstein needed a replacement so he could take his Christmas vacation. While at the ACLU office in Jackson getting ready for a Christmas Eve party, Jelinek got a frantic call from nearby Canton. Blacks there had initiated a Black Christmas boycott of local merchants, and authorities had responded with mass arrests. Canton was a tough town, and there were legitimate concerns about the treatment of the prisoners. Jelinek's call to the county's deputy sheriff elicited a hostile response. The FBI said it had no jurisdiction. Fearing for the safety of the inmates, Jelinek called the Canton police chief and told him that he was Walter Cronkite of CBS News. What follows is Jelinek at his creative and literary best, and is worth quoting in detail. Attempting valiantly to impersonate the TV commentator's neutral accent and sonorous baritone delivery, I inquired about the Christmas Eve arrests which the whole country is aroused about. I was immediately told that everybody was safe, received a complete list of those arrested, and learned the general nature of the charges and bail. The chief of police confided that he watched my show as often as he could, but complained that its coverage of the South did not tell the whole story. I, Cronkite, should visit there myself to see what is really happening. I assured him I would. The Canton prisoners were eventually freed, and soon Jelinek returned to New York, only to be recalled once again by the ACLU, this time to head up a new office in Alabama. The second half of the book begins with a discussion of black-white tensions within the movement as civil rights competed with black power. Jelinek offers a fresh perspective here. He arrived in the South just as veteran black activists, discouraged by the failure of the federal government to take decisive action against Jim Crow, became increasingly nationalistic, telling white volunteers they were no longer wanted or needed. Because Jelinek did not come south until the summer of 1965, he had not been subjected to the kind of mistrust and acrimony that many white volunteers had experienced in the months after Freedom Summer. While he was not immune to criticism because of his race, as a white attorney with a reputation for courage both inside and outside the courtroom, he had a certain cachet with influential black nationalists. ACLU leaders told Jelinek they chose him to head up their Alabama office because you have the best chance of being accepted by Stokely Carmichael. Jelinek's friendship with Stokely, and that is not too strong a characterization, began inauspiciously. In June of 1966, Jelinek was moving into his second-floor office in Selma when a black colleague told him that members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, had just posted a sign at the entrance, "No whites allowed upstairs without prior approval." Furious, the white attorney let it be known that he would not work for SNCC under such humiliating circumstances. Several days passed, and when one of his associates told him that the SNCC firebrand Rap Brown was in jail and needed a lawyer, Jelinek flatly refused. A few hours later he got a call from Stokely, fresh from his Black Power speech on the Meredith March. Carmichael told Don that he had heard many fine things about you, and I hope you will continue to be our friend and represent us. Adding, there will be no more signs and no more SNCC problems for you. And there weren't. Their relationship was both professional and casual. After Jelinek's mother wrote asking what Black Power really meant, Stokely laughingly replied, "Tell your mama when I find out, I'll let her know." SNCC expelled its white members in a famous meeting in upstate New York in December of 1966. Jelinek continued to represent SNCC workers in court until the middle of 1968. Don Jelinek did productive work for the ACLU in Alabama. He won a critical lawsuit gaining representation for black farmers on previously all-white local boards that distributed federal funds to white and black farmers. In pursuing this suit, he won the support of both Martin Luther King and Carmichael, who were at odds on the issue of tactics. Encouraged by this success, Jelinek continued his work on behalf of Alabama farmers. As director of the Southern Rural Research Project, he led a protest in Washington, D.C. against the U.S. Department of Agriculture, resulting in the federal agency providing the free distribution of food stamps and surplus food to the rural poor. He considered this victory one of the proudest moments of my life. Jelinek was also involved in elections in Selma and Dallas County, and here he discusses the implications of black against black tensions in the 1966 elections. Until recently, scholars have characterized the civil rights movement as a struggle between black activists and white racists. With passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, fissures developed in some black communities, with activists dividing along ideological and class lines. The SNCC faction in Selma, which Jelinek supported, favored an independent all-black ticket, while a more moderate and middle-class group affiliated with King and the SCLC worked within the Democratic Party to elect Wilson Baker, the white former public safety director, to replace the racist sheriff Jim Clark. The moderate group was successful, Baker was elected, and here Jelinek's identification with SNCC destroyed his relationship with Amelia Boynton, the local hero of the Selma movement and a leader of the moderates. Alabama Judge Frank Johnson has always been one of my heroes. As Jelinek notes, he was the most famous and revered federal judge in the South and the most prominent desegregationist judge in the nation. But I was surprised and dismayed to see another side of the famed jurist. Johnson was a tough law and order man with sentences longer than the national average, who despised the concept of black power as much as he did the beliefs and tactics of the Ku Klux Klan. This judgment appears harsh, but he had plenty of reason to be fearful of the judge, who saw Jelinek as a SNCC lawyer constantly pushing the boundaries of acceptable legal practice. One transgression led to another, and ultimately Judge Johnson ruled against Jelinek on every major issue, driving the attorney to distraction. Jelinek increasingly displayed what was often characterized as movement burnout. Martin Luther King's assassination had a further devastating impact on the white lawyer's psychological fatigue. He called Carmichael to tell him that his time in the South was nearing an end. Stokely replied that he was moving to Africa. The book ends as Jelinek leaves the South for an uncertain future in California. Eager to know more, I Googled Jelinek and was amazed to learn about his life after his sojourn in Mississippi and Alabama. In California, he joined the Bay Area veterans of the Civil Rights Movement. Continuing to practice law, he represented the group of Native Americans who seized Alcatraz Island in the 1969 occupation of that infamous prison. Beginning in 1971, he coordinated the defense of the inmates charged after the Attica prison riot in New York. Entering mainstream politics, he was elected to 3 terms on the Berkeley City Council. He ran for mayor of Berkeley in 1994 and 1998, but lost both races. Reading further, I saw his obituary. Donald Jelinek died in June of 2016 at age 82. He asked that his epitaph read, "He was part of SNCC." Somehow the news of his death stunned me. I felt as though I had lost a friend. White lawyer, black power adds much to our knowledge of the black freedom struggle, especially in the years following passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It belongs on that short shelf of movement memoirs by SNCC activists Cleveland Sellers, James Foreman, Stokely Carmichael, and Bob Zellner. The University of South Carolina Press deserves our gratitude for making Jelinek's memoir available to a new generation of civil rights scholars and students, and to readers everywhere who believe in the possibilities of democracy. John Dittmer, Professor Emeritus of History, DePaul University. Preface. I arrived in the Deep South in 1965, at a time of simmering unrest between black civil rights workers and their white counterparts. This turbulence eventually led to the ouster of most whites, although I had been allowed to remain at my post while black power spread throughout the civil rights movement. Prior to the civil rights movement, the post-Civil War 14th and 15th Amendments, equal protection and the right to vote, had been all but taken away by violence and segregationist laws in the South. Well into the 1960s, black residents of the Jim Crow South were excluded from white schools, restaurants, theaters, boarding houses, public parks, hospitals, libraries, swimming pools, and restrooms. They were confined to the rear of buses and to separate railroad cars. Separate Bibles were kept in courtrooms for colored witnesses to kiss. Their blood was segregated by the American Red Cross, and they were denied the right to vote. The years that preceded the passage of the landmark civil rights legislation were particularly vicious and bloody. During the summer of 1964 in the state of Mississippi alone, 3 civil rights workers were murdered, more than 1,000 protesters were arrested, and many others were beaten or shot at. Black churches were burned and homes were bombed. The overwhelming majority of civil rights workers did not fight back. Their most prominent leader, Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr., had promoted a model of passive resistance and nonviolence in which all were urged to turn the other cheek. But as the brutal backlash against the movement intensified, it increasingly took a toll on civil rights workers, especially those in their 20s who overwhelmingly comprised the most militant organization of that time, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, pronounced SNCC. As they settled into small rural communities, fighting for voting and other civil rights, these SNCC workers became the shock troops of the movement, absorbing much of the physical abuse. The enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965 did not, in itself, mark much immediate improvements in the lives of Southern blacks. Nor did civil rights bills, as noted by a SNCC worker at the time, address basic problems. They had no effect on the South's rigid system of caste and class oppression, and the laws were not addressed to the economic oppression of poor blacks. Blacks were not being lynched and dumped into muddy rivers across the South because they weren't integrated. Black babies were not dying of malnutrition because their parents did not own homes in white communities. Black men and women were not being forced to pick cotton for $3 a day because of segregation. Integration had little or no effect on such problems. Having endured too much brutality and not enough progress, SNCC leaders increasingly adopted a more defiant approach that put them in conflict with Dr. King and most other civil rights organizations. The tensions came to a head in June 1966 on a blistering hot day in Mississippi. 25-year-old Stokely Carmichael, the new leader of SNCC, was arrested without cause. Upon his release and seething with anger, he made his way back to address his supporters. His aggrieved words that day shocked a nation that, for the most part, had considered the battle for racial equality already won. "This is the 27th time I've been arrested, and I ain't going to jail no more. The only way we going to stop them white men from whooping us is to take over. We been saying freedom for 6 years and we ain't got nothing. What we going to start saying now is black power." "Black power!" the crowd roared in unison. "What do you want? Black power! What do you want? Black power! What do you want? Black power! Black power! Black power!" For SNCC, everything that followed was an echo of that moment. The national press latched onto the slogan "Black Power" and embellished it with warnings of an imminent racial cataclysm. Carmichael, the most charismatic new civil rights personality since Dr. King, personified and promoted the ideals of black power. "It is our position that black organizations should be black-led and essentially black-staffed, with policy being made by black people." In a sweeping move, Carmichael reached beyond the South and roamed about the country, a Johnny Appleseed, planting black pride as he spoke with sharecroppers, college audiences, and urban ghetto dwellers. The television cameras captured his good looks and devilish smile as, in the tradition of Malcolm X, he urged defiance of the man and the U.S. government. When he yelled "Black Power," his message was, "Respect yourself. And your mama." I watched him when he gave a speech to students at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. It was unlike anything I had ever heard from a major civil rights leader. "Why do you girls insist on dressing like Jackie Kennedy? I know who you are. And you guys that slicked back hair ain't gonna fool the man. He know you a nigger. Okra and hominy grits are beautiful. Black girls are beautiful. Your daddy is beautiful. African clothes are beautiful. African hair is beautiful. You are beautiful." The roar of the students was deafening as they stood cheering and pounding on their chairs. Blackness! This was going to be Carmichael's greatest achievement. He urged black people to accept themselves, to stop trying to be white, to be proud of their skin and culture, and to demand equal access to the economic benefits of white America. On June 16, 1966, the very day that Stokely Carmichael was delivering his Black Power speech, I was driving to Selma, Alabama from Jackson, Mississippi, to open an Alabama civil rights legal office located on the floor below Carmichael's headquarters. I would remain in Alabama for 2 additional years. In this book, I will tell the story of the journey I traveled along with my civil rights colleagues through the once harmonious civil rights movement into the increasing influence of the militant Black Power movement, and eventually to the end of the movement as we had known it. A note on the content. The names of most sharecroppers have been changed throughout this book, not to protect them from exposure, since they have already undergone the dangers of such exposure, but to avoid further invading their privacy. The names of some civil rights workers have been changed as well, also for reasons of privacy. Those whose names are changed are shown by quotation marks the first time the name is used. 1. Black and White Together. We Shall Overcome. 1. Going South. On August 15, 1965, I flew to Jackson, Mississippi for a 3-week stint as a civil rights lawyer. I was unsure of what would greet me, but I had some idea. It would not be my first encounter with the fearsome realities of the Jim Crow South. While serving in the U.S. Army in 1958, I was stationed at Fort Jackson in South Carolina, the first state to secede from the Union and where the first shots of the Civil War were fired. 10 years before my arrival at Fort Jackson, President Harry Truman had integrated the U.S. military, creating the only zone of equal rights in the South. As a result, the military also became a major source of black employment in the former Confederate states. At Fort Jackson, my basic training was accompanied by the shouts of 3 black drill sergeants, which was not taken well by white trainees from the region. A few weeks after my arrival, I was befriended by Morris, one of the black sergeants, who enjoyed talking with a Yankee lawyer. One day I suggested we go into town for a movie on my next weekend pass. "Are you crazy?" Morris almost shouted. "I could be killed, and maybe you too." "Just for going to the movies?" "Don't you know anything about where you are?" he asked angrily. When I didn't reply, he called over the other 2 black sergeants and repeated what I had proposed. Acting as if I wasn't present, one of the other sergeants snorted and said, "He obviously doesn't understand anything about the South. Does he even know about Emmett Till?" "Do you know about Emmett Till?" Morris asked. "The 14-year-old boy from Chicago who was beaten and murdered because he spoke to a white woman?" They all looked at me, but didn't wait for me to answer. "Come with us," I was directed, and I followed the sergeants into their barracks. When we entered, Morris looked around guiltily as if he were about to commit a serious crime. "Look and see what they did to the boy." He opened his footlocker and pulled out a hidden copy of Jet magazine. "Look at the photos." Under pressure, and feeling I had done something seriously wrong, I looked at the photos. I didn't know what I was looking at. "What is this?" I asked. "It's the boy," they responded, almost in chorus. "Oh, my God," I whispered, feeling woozy. I did not say what I was thinking. Is this a human body? We would talk about many things in my remaining time at Fort Jackson, but never again about Emmett Till. Much later, I read his mother's account of what had happened. Emmett Till had traveled from Chicago to Mississippi to visit his uncle and cousins. Mamie Till had warned her son about danger in the South. "Don't start up any conversation with white people in Mississippi. Only talk if you are spoken to, and you respond, 'Yes, sir,' 'Yes, ma'am,' 'No, sir,' 'No, ma'am.' If you're walking down the street and a white woman is walking toward you, stay off the sidewalk, lower your head, don't look her in the eye. Wait until she passes by, then get back on the sidewalk, keep going, don't look back. If you have to humble yourself, then just do it. Get on your knees if you have to." On August 28, 1955, a few days after arriving in Mississippi, Emmett Till entered a country store to purchase candy. As if he were still in Chicago, the young man spoke to the white wife of the storekeeper. Later, Till was accused of chatting her up and maybe looking her over. Likely his only crime was speaking to her as an equal, showing a lack of deference to a white woman. Her husband told his brother after he learned of the encounter. That night, the two men seized the boy from Chicago and removed him from the home of his uncle. They dumped him in a truck and drove to a barn where they savagely tortured him. Till was pistol-whipped, had an eye gouged out, and was shot through the head before they dropped him into the Tallahatchie River, his body weighted down with a cotton gin fan tied around his neck with barbed wire. 3 days later, his swollen, disfigured, and nude body was found by two boys fishing in the river. A Mississippi relative telephoned Mamie Till to tell her of her son's death. Although near faint from shock and grief, she demanded that his body not be buried in the South and that it must be sent back to Chicago. When the corpse arrived, she insisted there be no pre-burial cosmetic work and called for an open casket memorial and funeral, saying, "There was just no way I could describe what was in that box. No way. And I just wanted the world to see." During the killer's murder trial, their counsel claimed the body might not even be that of a human. The defense also argued that the body couldn't be identified as Emmett Till because the face of the corpse was unrecognizable due to the beatings and having been submerged in water for 3 days. An all-white jury acquitted the two killers. One juror stated afterward that the panel believed the two men were guilty, but that life imprisonment or the death penalty did not seem proper punishment for whites who had merely killed a disrespectful black person. After the verdict was rendered, the murderers confessed their guilt in Look magazine in 1956. They were paid $4,000 for their story. The torture and murder of Emmett Till, with photographs of his mutilated body and press accounts of thousands who had lined up around the block to view his open casket, horrified most Americans and propelled some of them into action. The outrage eventually coalesced into marches, sit-ins, freedom rides, and the national convulsion that came to be known as the Civil Rights Movement. If the U.S. Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954 had broken the legal back of segregation, as the Reverend Jesse Jackson said, the murder of Emmett Till broke the emotional back of segregation. Less than 90 days after Till's funeral, 42-year-old Rosa Parks was riding a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, returning home from her job as a seamstress sewing and pressing clothes at a local department store. Under bus segregation laws, whites sat in the front rows with black passengers in the back rows. If one white person boarded a full bus, Everyone in the black row nearest the front was required to get up and stand, so that a new whites-only
Sample complete. Ready to continue?